Здравствуйте, мои дорогие любители хорошего кинематографа, качественной еды и элитного алкоголя. Меня зовут old.silentium.vulpes и добро пожаловать на мой канал. Смотрите видео, оставляйте комментарии и подписывайтесь на сам канал для поддержки меня. Также вы можете поддержать меня финансово через Donationalis, DonatPay и платной подпиской на Boosty. Для уведомлений о прямых трансляциях и прочих активностей обязательно подпишитесь на телеграм-канал. Все ссылочки есть в описании. Спасибо и приятного просмотра.
I watch every president's favorite movie. Так, давайте посмотрим.
All-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. My fellow Americans, I am not one to talk about politics too often on this channel, but because it's an election year, I thought I'd have a little bit of fun and talk about some US presidents, specifically their favorite movies. Everybody...
Ну, это как бы не очень интересно, потому что это просто будет какая-то история популярного кинематографа. Я не думаю, что там что-то необычное у них есть во вкусах американских президентов.
Favorite movie, even the people who have led this country, and your favorite says a lot about you. I hate to say it. I'll be ranking these in order from worst to best. Movie, not president, please keep that in mind. I found these answers through various sources, many of which differ from one another. I kind of just went with what popped up the most on most of these lists. Also, it goes without saying, for a lot of presidents, movies simply did not exist, or they were so new that they don't really have a favorite on record. Another disclaimer is that I'm going by movies they actually said were their favorites. Just because they screened it in the White House does not mean it was their favorite movie. That said, I'm skipping Woodrow Wilson's pick, which was Birth of a Nation, as well as FDR's pick, which was I'm No Angel. I found a much more interesting and accurate answer for FDR. Anyway, that's enough blabbering. Like this video, let's see what happens.
Вот бы у кого-нибудь был Хрусталев машину любимым.
Without any further ado.
Вот у Рейгана. Сейчас узнаем. Ну вот тут уже как бы выбрали рождение нации, вот это хороший вкус.
Of movies. He was more into, I kid you not, Mickey Mouse cartoons. They provided him and a lot of other people a sense of escapism and joy in the midst of the Great Depression. And I thought this was fun enough to include, but couldn't put it any higher than last place because I just didn't know where else to put it. Of all the cartoons to pick from, Steamboat Willie is the example I went with. Probably the most iconic. It tells the story of Mickey Mouse who is driving a boat and he starts playing music. This was not my
нормально просто как бы любимая у лидера нации это Микки Маус. Вот уровень как бы правителей Соединенных Штатов. Люблю мультики веселые.
Viewing of it, but yeah, I enjoy this little cartoon. I chuckle at it. The animation still looks great. That's what I gotta say about Steamboat Willie. Viva Zapata is the favorite film of our 41st president, George H.W. Bush. Bush, like FDR, did not seem to be a big movie guy. In fact, while I found this to be his favorite movie from two separate sources, I couldn't find a detailed explanation for why, other than he named his oil company Zapata Corporation after it. And while I don't think this is a total stinker, it is probably the worst feature on this list. Viva Zapata tells the story of Emiliano Zapata, the Mexican revolutionary who became the leader of the Liberation Army of the South during the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. The film stars Marlon Brando as the titular Zapata, which...
Фига себе. Вихарьков, здравствуйте. Барон фон Шварцкопф, приветствую. Опять рейд сюда кинул. Спасибо большое, Ежи Сармат. Опять он кинул сюда рейд. Спасибо огромное. Здравствуйте, Ежи Сармат. Рад вас видеть и безумно благодарен за рейд. Всех приветствую, кто к нам присоединился. Мы здесь смотрим видео любимых фильмов президентов Соединенных Штатов и их рейтинг. Киномомич, здравствуйте. Здравствуйте. Всем рад видеть. Всех рад видеть, кто пришел от Ежи Сармата. И особенно Ежи Сармата рад видеть. Надеюсь, мы когда-нибудь снова сделаем совместный стрим.
Let's unpack that. Listen, I do think Brando does a decent job, even if he's slipping in and out of the accent throughout the film. He still has a very gripping screen presence. This is certainly a good example of that.
Это настоящий Ежи? Ну, да, наверное. Вопрос, что такое настоящий Ежи, это как бы дискуссионный вопрос. Может быть, Ежи подменили когда-то. Маргинала-то подменили. Ежи фон Триер не любят. Но есть что обсудить, значит, получается.
But the choice to cast him as this character, as well as the choice to have most of the oppressed Mexican characters in the film played by white people...
Ну, совместка 50к стоит. Ну, что такое-то оверпрайс? Не знаю. Я как бы не готов платить за совместки.
I mean, it certainly makes it hard to take a lot of what this film has to say seriously. It's just a movie riddled with contradictions for that reason. But taking a step back, I do see the film as no different from a lot of biopics we see today, Wikipedia article biopics that is. It's here to retell the story of this man's life in the most condensed and straightforward way possible, which I think it does a decent job at. I do think this
Уже 15? Как быстро это самое, ценник-то падает.
Makes a surprising amount of interesting choices for its genre, but it is at the end of the day...
Так это зрелые могут заплатить ему. Ну, если зрелые ежи могут заплатить ему за совместку со мной, я не против. Сомневаюсь, что мои зрители будут платить кому-то за совместку со мной кому-то.
A Wikipedia article. You'll learn about as much from this film as you do from a quick Google search. If you're a Brando completionist, knock yourself out. But other than that, there's really no reason to watch this movie. It's for these reasons why I do see it as a pretty funny and accurate favorite
Он
film
заплатит
for
тебе
a
50?
politician. It thinks it's saying a whole lot, but it isn't. It's telling the story of an oppressed group of people.
Я не продаюсь. Да, господа, можно подзарядиться, 700 рублей выпью за ваше здоровье, с удовольствием. Я же проиграл уже 50к жмелю. Ну что, всякое бывает. То есть поэтому я не люблю такие азартные игры и споры в этом плане. По той причине, что я всегда проигрываю, мне вот не везет. Поэтому даже не пытаюсь. И в рулеточку не играю.
With white actors. Not the worst movie in the world, but probably the worst on this list. What I find craziest about this, though, is it turns out we could have lived in a world where it was the favorite of 2 presidents, as this was...
Блин, ну, конечно, прям совсем как Брандо выглядит, как мексиканец. И, конечно, он сильно поправился, как по апокалипсису сейчас, недавно смотрели. Который щечками, как я.
Apparently the favorite of John McCain as well. What these fellas saw in this, I have no idea, but there are so many other mediocre biopics that get across the
Главное сейчас на Трампа не ставить.
Same idea that I'm sure they would have gotten a kick out of. Chariots of Fire is the favorite film of our current president at the time of recording this, Joe Biden, the 46th president of the United States. Chariots of Fire is about 2 young runners who are training for the Olympics, one of them being a devout Christian and the other being Jewish, and the obstacles they overcome to achieve their dreams. Chariots of Fire won Best Picture in 1982, a pretty big head-scratcher in my opinion, considering what else was up that year, but it also won Best Original Score, which I think it definitely deserved, because the iconic score to this thing still goes very hard. It is, in my opinion, the only exceptional part of this film. I'm not into sports dramas as is, but this is a really stale one. Sure, it does its best to...
Короче, Бидону нравятся фильмы про студенческую дружбу.
Infuse more juice into the genre than it typically is able to carry, like some food for thought on religion, pride, and general sense of purpose, but all of it still gets filtered down into a fairly generic sports drama. Feels ultimately like wasted potential. To me, the main reason Chariots of Fire fails to resonate with me is the 2 main characters are just painfully uninteresting. They have a lot going for them. Never once did I fear they were in danger or that anything they were going through necessarily mattered. The best moments...
Сейчас спортивная драма, это по сути Гран-при.
Running scenes were very well directed and made use of slow motion cinematography in an interesting way, but at the same time, pretty much all of these running scenes were in slow motion, which doesn't get you particularly excited about any of it. The film only has a handful of tricks, and those tricks get less interesting the longer it goes on. Biden's
Чувствую, его новый любимый фильм будет боепик про Трампа. Так типа он абсолютно не комплементарен будет про Трампа, вы думаете?
Reasoning behind this being his favorite.
Я бы просто взял ваши щечки и приготовили, я надеюсь. Вы бы тоже были бы людоедом. Взяли бы их, пожарили.
Is that quote, someone put personal fame and glory behind principles. That to me is the mark of real heroism. He even referenced it in his first address as president-elect. While I don't think Chariots of Fire is an outright bad film, its earnestness is certainly admirable, and I'd imagine part of why it comes off so bland is because it paved the way for so many sports dramas I've seen since it came out. I also do believe that this is Biden's favorite movie. It's too specific for me to think he's bullshitting us, and I think that's worth admiring as well. Gone with the Wind is the favorite.
Да, конечно же, вот эти все любимые фильмы и прочие, которые официально заявляют президенты, не придумывают политологи. Не то чтобы это политологи создают образ какой-то. Хрен знает вообще, какой любимый фильм у кого. Я думаю, это все такая Все такая игра.
Film of Jimmy Carter, the 39th president of the United States, and this bummed me out, as for a long time I
Я признаюсь, тоже не смотрел «Унесенные
thought
ветром».
I would be talking about All the President's Men or Midnight Cowboy when talking about Carter, far more interesting films that he screened at the White House.
«Ковбой» вообще великолепный фильм. Отлично смотрится и сейчас, мы его сильно недавно пересматривали.
That I was hyped to dive into, but upon doing some more research, apparently out of the over 400 films he screened at the White House, his all-time favorite was Gone with the Wind, as far as I can tell. Gone with the Wind is about a turbulent romance that takes place in the South in the midst of the Civil War. It's one of the biggest and most successful films of all time. Now, I want to say, I don't want to come across like I went into this with a sour mindset. I did go in thinking maybe this would win me over. I went in with an understanding that it would be a bit dicey with the racism and pro-Confederacy stuff, but that it was a product of its time that still made for a gripping watch. I thought I would at the very least be enthralled by its storytelling, but I was honestly surprised at just how dull this whole thing was. It's gotta be up there as one of my least favorite classics. Look at it this way, I've seen people compare this to Titanic in terms of its massive success, how it was at one point the biggest movie that had ever been made and the most successful one too. But you watch Titanic today, even if it's your first time, and you can easily see why it was such a success. It's actual movie magic in how easily you can get wrapped into...
Ну, есть такие фильмы, которым прям как будто бы кинематограф сосредоточен. Не скажу, что мне в целом нравятся любовные истории, и фильмы про любовные истории вызывают скорее, ну, какую-то такую брезгливость у меня. Но вот если это не про любовь, и какой-нибудь такой, как бы сказать, какой-нибудь биопик про мою Америку, по типу там нефти, либо авиатора, это всегда как-то заставляет тебя волноваться.
The movie, thanks to quite literally everything about it. So I was kind of expecting a similar sort of grip from Gone with the Wind. There had to be a reason why this was so accessible and successful, but there was no grip. I even went in recently Fleming-pilled, having been reminded how great Wizard of Oz was just last month. Talk about timeless entertainment, but Gone with the Wind is quite frankly very stuck in its time. I mean, technically speaking, there are some undeniably breathtaking shots here and there, especially for the time. There had never been anything that looked as vibrant or as extreme as this, unless we're talking Fleming's other film that came out earlier that year. The costumes are nice, the production design is interesting. This is still leagues above Chariots of Fire and Viva Zapata, because I do think there's something to respect and admire about its ambition.
В общем, это такой фильм, который ты можешь назвать, типа, это мой любимый, и тебе никто ничего не скажет.
It does feel epic, but it really falls short in also feeling like an uninspired book-to-film adaptation, completely stuck to the page, sometimes directionless, only achieving any sort of movement because of the use of lighting and performance. Just to put it plain and simple, I didn't really care about these characters, and the film did so little to win me over on them. Scarlett O'Hara specifically just gets more annoying the deeper into the film you get. It's a frustrating watch and doesn't feel like you learn a whole lot about them in the process. The iconic line, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," is such a perfect moment, not only because it lands really well by that point in the film, but it's also exactly how I felt by that point. Yes, I'm aware I'm probably the last person to quote that line as a way of reviewing the film, but I'm doing it anyway. Simply put, while there is a lot to say about this film's place in film history, the film itself...
Но опять же, с другой стороны, когда вот вы какой-то роман адаптируете и ставите его, тоже сложно отойти от текста, потому что все начнут клевать, говорить, что это вот придумали.
Run-of-the-mill melodrama. To be fair, even Carter admitted all the way back in 1977 that, quote, "It was a great movie. It's not quite as good now as it was then." But just before that, he did state, "In the South, we date life either before Gone with the Wind and after Gone with the Wind, as you know." So maybe if you were to ask him today, there's a chance he'd have a different favorite. But even if he admits it doesn't have the same buzz, I can't be too surprised that a film as rooted in the South resonated so deeply with a guy like Jimmy Carter. If nothing else, I'm glad I can finally say I watched this. It feels good to not have this one looming over me anymore. Field of Dreams is the favorite film of George W. Bush, the 43rd president of the United States.
Ну да, ну еще один фильм, который я не видел. В общем, президенты смотрят то, что не смотрю я. Так что я не буду никогда президентом Соединенных Штатов Америки. к сожалению, судя по моим киновкусам.
States, and there is a lot to unpack about that. Every time I told a friend
Это какая-то спортивная драма про бейсбол.
George W. Bush's favorite movie was Field of Dreams, they've gotten a real kick out of it. And I got a real kick out of it too. It's like the most George W. Bush movie you can think of. Field of Dreams, if you didn't know, is about an Iowa man who builds a baseball field for ghosts.
Короче, судя по всему, они реально говноеды, смотрящие спортивные драмы. Это как бы нужно быть типа нормальным челиком, смотреть спортивные драмы, играть в фифу на поплойке, вот это вот все. Тогда будешь президентом.
Just incredible. This not only tracks because of Bush's love for baseball, but the film deals with lots of dad stuff. And like I said, this does track as being a Bush film. It's got this sincere quality to it, but it's also kind of stupid. I find its approach to its themes of grief and fatherhood to be pretty interesting and actually quite touching by the end. The game of catch thing, I hate to say, kind of won me over. I don't mean to imply Bush had actual daddy issues, but his dad was clearly a big figure in his life, probably the most a dad could be a figure in your life. So an earnest yet absolutely bonkers movie about fatherhood that also happens to be a touching road trip film that celebrates the country from northern Minnesota to Boston. It's just all tracks. There are the occasional moments that make you scratch your head, like Annie's rant about peace not war at the school. Kind of interesting. But as far as my own thoughts on the film go, if you can't tell, it is a bit of a mixed bag for me. Even if I find a lot of this to be a bit of an eye roll, it's such an extreme eye roll that I actually come out a bit charmed by it. Even if the execution of this far-fetched idea gets a little clunky and nonsensical, it sticks the landing in a way that makes it all feel worth it. It's just
насрать на этот вид спорта. На спорт в целом в кино, и на этот вид спорта конкретно.
Plain entertaining too, which is pretty impressive for a science fiction film that's really just a guy talking to baseball players and driving around in a car for a while. I enjoyed it, yes, but I'm certainly not going to be on the front lines fighting for it anytime soon. According to an article about Bush's relationship to baseball from The Atlantic, the film apparently, quote, made him cry. He once said because it reminded him...
Ну, типа, вообще, как бы, в целом, типа, я люблю бейсбол, я люблю фильмы про бейсбол. Тоже как бы ход гения.
Of playing catch in the backyard with his father, a pretty fair ball player himself once. Bush crying to Field.
А еще я люблю, когда мне битву в жопу засовывают.
Dreams is like the funniest image in my head. I should note other favorites of his include We Were Soldiers and Black Hawk Down, films he would watch as the country fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Field of Dreams, for all these reasons and more, is such a perfect film for George W. Bush, I couldn't not pick this one. Dr. No is the favorite.
В 2014 году во время прямой линии, отвечая на вопрос о том, какой любимый фильм, Владимир Путин сообщил, какой любимый фильм. Чапаев, конечно. Ну. Короче, надо сделать такое же эссе про Россию. Правда, оно будет значительно короче.
Film of John F. Kennedy, the 35th president of the United States.
Надо узнать, какой любимый фильм был у Бориса Николаевича и какой любимый фильм был у Дмитрия Анатольевича. Им, точнее, не было, а есть, может быть. Может, что поменялось.
States. When you look at the films we have here, most of them are just either universally loved classics or painfully safe picks, but Dr. No is just kind of fun. The first James Bond movie, hell yeah, that's a choice. JFK was in general a big fan of James Bond, having received a copy
Синяя Мита и приветствую. Еще по одной.
Of Casino Royale while suffering from back problems in 1955. He even once said, I wish I had James Bond on my staff. Some even say this was only his favorite movie because JFK
Бондиада не лучшие фильмы про спецагентов, как по мне.
He liked to pretend he was Bond. James Bond movies are admittedly a huge blind spot for me, despite them being my own father's favorite films. I let you down, Dad. But watching Dr. No, the first Bond, made me realize how much I would actually like these films. I should really dive in one of these days, especially knowing some of them do what this does much better. And this is pretty good. I don't know who to owe this one to, my TV, the scan, or the cinematographer, but the colors in this thing really pop. That plus young Sean Connery's handsomeness makes this a really nice movie to look at. I also love the gadgets. There's just a lot of good eye candy. I like this one a lot because it does stand out next to these other films. It doesn't actually feel like it's about anything relevant to the presidency or the country, unless we really want to reach for answers.
Особенно фраза «ну выпей на работе». Ну тогда это, получается, и Борис Николаевич тоже подойдет.
With a lot of these picks, the president is either trying to pick the best.
Хотя не знаю, мог бы... По-моему, 5 бутылок водки еще вышли. Или уже нет. Уже в 2000 именно вышел. Какой там год?
Movie ever to look good, or they're picking something that does contain themes that directly align with either their life or the current time of the country. Even Steamboat Willie has some significance, but Dr. No is really just a fun time.
Значит, к сожалению, не попадает в его президентский срок.
There's a very cool vibe emanating off of this, and sometimes that's enough to call something your favorite movie. Sometimes the presidents are just like us. They wish they were that guy on the screen. Which brings me to our next film. Patton was the favorite film of Richard Nixon, the 37th president of the United States, and this is one I definitely believe. Nixon really loved this movie. Nixon apparently watched the film multiple times around the same time he decided to invade Cambodia, and while he has denied that the film had any influence over his decision-making, there is certainly some speculation that it did, which is pretty wild, the power of cinema, I guess, and I would say his borderline obsession with the film speaks to the film's strength as a character piece. Patton, if you didn't know, is a biopic about the controversial World War II general George S. Patton, and I have to say I was kind of surprised by how much I enjoyed this movie. This is not the kind of thing I would normally get into, but I kind of liked it. Firstly, it's fucking gorgeous to look at. Some absolutely breathtaking shots in this thing. It's a fantastic use of the frame. Gorgeous colors. Even the iconic opening scene, which is simply a speech in front of the American flag, looks a lot better than it needed to. I guess...
А что такой маленький флаг? Мне кажется, он был побольше, чтобы он был совсем такой маленький человечек в полосу одну флага.
I expected nothing less from the same man who directed the original Planet of the Apes.
Ну, композиционно смотрится круто очень.
Another film that really knows how to capture landscapes. And then there's the script, which is...
Когда Борис Ельцин стал президентом, у него на даче тоже был свой кинотеатр. По словам Дьяченко, Борис Николаевич любил советскую классику. «Девчата», «Калина красная», «Любовь и голуби». Помимо этого он смотрел боевики, детективы, истечки, экшен. Нравились ему фильмы с Жан-Полем Бельмондо, Брюсом Ли, Арнольдом Шварценеггером и особенно с исполнителем роли индейцев югославским актером Гойко Мидичем. Большое впечатление произвел на Ельцина и его семью «Титаник» Джеймса Кэмерона. Официальное кино про колхозы и совхозы, производственные проблемы и будни трудовых коллективов они смотрели в свободное время. Смотреть в свободное время не хотели. Эти фильмы полагались обычным гражданам, отметил бывший зять Ельцина. Вот так вот. Это для гоев. Отвлечение для гоев.
A little straightforward and dry, but does have some really great dialogue. I mean, pretty much every scene has a quotable that most of the time George C. Scott is delivering the shit out of. Whoever wrote this thing is going places. Best of luck to you, Francis.
Там больше факт был у Объединенных Арабских... Нет, ОАО это что у нас? Это акционерное общество. Ну, я имею в виду в фильме. Как бы в фильме-то могли любого размера
For Kopala, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The film is a little repetitive after a certain point, and what say that it potentially influenced Nixon. Maybe not the most successful or blatantly anti-war film out there, although there's an argument to be made.
В общем, какие-то стерильные обывательские вкусы у президентов.
It wasn't entirely.
Было бы что-то реально интересное там.
Trying to be that, as much as it was trying to be a character piece. I personally read it as somewhat of a tragic and humanistic portrayal of a very complicated man, which in the process certainly comes off anti-war, though I can't say I'm surprised that someone like Nixon could obsess over it from a different angle. Some of us think James Bond is cool, and apparently some of us think Patton is cool. To each their own, I guess. The Searchers is the favorite film of...
О, наконец-то, хоть что-то, что я смотрел. Мне кстати, безумно нравятся «Искатели», и это офигенный вестерн. Наверное, из таких классических мой любимый. Ну, не то, чтобы я их прям безумное количество смотрел, но «Искатели» офигенная вещь вообще про то, как... Ну, во-первых, сама концепция, что что-то ищут, куда-то едут, такая одиссея, и концовка поражает. То есть, как там девочку украли, она Постепенно, не постепенно, а просто они ее находят, а она уже не эта девочка. То есть она абсолютно растворилась с настоящим глубинным народом Америки. Стала его частью уже.
Lyndon B. Johnson,
То есть такое как бы в конце ощущение какого-то разочарования всего
the
происходящего.
36th President of the United States. And it's one of the 2 John Ford movies that made the list. In fact, I should note now that a lot of the films that make this list are Westerns. Lyndon B. Johnson was apparently not a big movie guy, but he did enjoy John Wayne movies, specifically this one. Other favorites according to his website include Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and James Bond movies, just like JFK. Timing just so happened to line up perfectly, and I got...
В общем, пленки для Пакудзи только для нормальных людей, да. Ну, пленки для Пакудзи реально говно, даже скучное, не знаю. Почему этот фильм вообще кто-то вспоминает, я бы никогда бы его не пересматривал. Это хрень просто.
to catch this one in
Дешевая,
70mm at the
глупая.
Music Box Theater, which was
Актер красивый,
unsurprisingly
безумно.
incredible. I genuinely think John Ford is one of the most skilled filmmakers of all time when it comes to finding the perfect shot. He's a master at finding the balance between crafting a beautiful image whilst also moving the story forward in the perfect way. This and My Darling Clementine were a wake-up call that I need to watch more of his films soon. All of that said, this is probably the hardest one to talk about on this list. It's a prickly film that you could argue hasn't aged well, but I would argue it's also looking in the mirror at the genre and challenging the deeply racist views of its main character in a way few westerns
Байдену нравится «Старый рассвет мертвецов», потому что это единственный фильм, за которым он успевает. Байдену что там нравилось? Какая-то хрень про бегунов. Вот это вот ему нравилось.
are able to do. It's a very uncomfortable movie, no doubt, and there are
Почему я о нем говорю в прошедшем числе? В итоге лучшая мокюментари это Крип. Ну, Крип это типа found footage, не мокюментари. Мокюментари это псевдодокументальный фильм. Это немного разные вещи. А как тебе фильм «Костяной томагавк»? «Костяной томагавк» неплохой, но медленный. То есть, если его пересматривать, там есть проблема, то что большую часть фильма ничего не происходит. Вот. А found footage... Ну, Крип прикольный, но, например, тот же самый Кловерфилд, который мы смотрели, ну, он как-то типа поинтереснее сделан. Крип просто забавный. Не знаю, мне кажется, я еще не видел тот found footage, который бы мне нравился.
That do feel painfully dated, but the intentions
Прям вот я бы сказал бы, да, это лучше. Мне кажется, возможности не использованы до конца, и всегда есть какие-то условности.
The film are actually easier to see today than they were then. If you want my quick answer of whether or not it's aged well, the best I can do is say some of it has, some of it hasn't. If the answer was that black and white, the film wouldn't be nearly as interesting, which is to say I can't exactly say I know why this is Lyndon B. Johnson's favorite movie. I wonder...
Паранормальное явление. Ну, кстати, паранормальное явление реально получше, первое паранормальное явление получше Крипа будет. И получше, наверное, даже Кловерфилда, если брать его как found footage. Вот, там есть условность, кто это все смонтировал, как это все смонтировал, которая не раскрывается, но там неплохо все объясняется и все встраивается, что является плюсом. Но вот проблема обычно всех этих found footage, что там есть как бы некоторые вещи, которые нельзя объяснить, например, почему люди не бросают камеру, почему они продолжают снимать в некоторых ситуациях. Мне кажется, вот это надо вводить и как бы как-то эту условность объяснять, потому что не всегда, как человек, который со съемками связан, есть с этим проблемы. Я бы, наверное, мне нравится эффект в Кловерфилде, в Монстр, то, что там как бы пленка на пленку записана поверх. Хотя тоже механизм записи пленки поверх пленки немного не так работает. И там не было бы частей, которые как бы пропущены, если бы они просто вставили пленку и начали записывать заново. Поэтому тут тоже странно. Для этого им нужно было там что-то пересмотреть, перемотать и как-то пытаться на новый момент переехать. Тогда бы это было. Короче, не очень-то продумано глубоко. Надо было над этим получше поработать.
how he read the film, what he got out of it. At the end of the day, it's withstood the test of time partly because it's a damn good adventure film that happens to be wildly entertaining. So maybe it wasn't that deep for him. Maybe he just thought it was a good time. But I'm glad it was his favorite film, as it gave me an excuse to stop beating around the bush and watch it. High Noon is the favorite film of 2 presidents. Now that's pretty crazy. Both Dwight Eisenhower and Bill Clinton loved this damn movie. Reagan also was a fan, but I decided to go with something else for him. And if I'm being completely honest, I totally see why, for a few reasons. High Noon tells the story of a retired marshal who on the day of his wedding discovers a former criminal is coming to town to seek revenge, and he only has a few hours to rally the town to help fight the criminal. I'll be honest, based on the synopsis for this and seeing as though this was my like 4th Western of the week, I kind of begrudgingly jumped into this one, not really expecting much, but it didn't take long for me to be completely glued to the screen. What a great script. According to the New York Times article about the film's reputation in the White House, Jay Hoberman writes, quote, "Present for a show early in the first term, a magazine writer reported the president unusually engrossed. On the screen, Gary Cooper's weary marshal stood alone. Stalked through his empty town by 4 implacable killers, he had taken refuge in a barn, and now the bad guys had set it on fire. Eisenhower bent forward in genuine anxiety," the journalist noted. As Cooper leaped onto the horse and headed out of the barn, the President of the United States could contain himself no longer. "Run," shouted Ike. That was, I have to admit, also my experience with this movie. I also could contain myself no longer. According to Clinton, quote, "It's a movie about courage in the face of fear and the guy doing what he thought was right in spite of the fact that it could cost him everything," end quote. Clinton supposedly screamed it 20 times while in the White House, so I don't think there's any doubt that this was his favorite movie. And while watching the film, it's not hard to see why this one resonates with so many presidents. The central tale of a man trying to unite a town is inherently presidential. It's told in a way
не смотрели, такие, блин, это же literally я же этим занимаюсь.
That almost exactly mirrors a primary election.
Если успешные фильмы без трехактной структуры, естественно, «Криминальное чтиво», например.
You have to be crazy to want to be president, and it's the same kind of craziness Cooper has to put himself in this situation in the movie, choosing to sacrifice himself for his community over a safe and secure life. It's exciting and easy to empathize with if you're in that position of power. To me, it's the film's stiff and straightforward approach that makes it both easy to get invested in and also just shy of something even more special. Cooper could be a much more interesting character.
Какой-нибудь «Психо» не имеет трехактную структуру, он имеет двухчастное деление, то есть история вот этой женщины и потом некоторый переворот, что она не главная героиня, может так. Так что в целом есть много фильмов, которые не работают по трехактной структуре, и вполне себе нормальные. Но вот самый простой способ — это, конечно, сделать какое-то лоскутное одеяло, и там такой структуры не будет.
If you weren't so...
Да, «Целенаправленная тоже имеет двухактную структуру. Как бы как 2 части, которые за счет цветов, ну как бы не цветов, а темы, они как бы резонируют друг с другом. То есть первая вот эта учебка, которая всем просто нравится, очень смешная. Вот. Когда показывают обычную войну, им не очень заходит, что-то на минуту.
Unnoted and narrow-minded. Same goes for the killers in the story who are given the most bare-boned backstory imaginable. But for what this sets out to do, it's a pretty good time. Speaking of good times... Home Alone was the favorite film of Gerald Ford, the 38th president of the United States, which is kind of funny.
Кстати, «Один дома», первая часть, вполне себе классный фильм, кайфовый. И то, что там даже главный герой видит в этом каком-то бомже-одиночке себя, типа что вот он превратится в такого человека, это интересная тема. Так что там даже есть какой-то такой слой немного философский.
Apparently Ford was not a big movie fan at all. In fact, for my money, I doubt he's even seen Home Alone in full. It was probably just the...
То есть, как бы тема-то простая, что надо со всеми как бы любить семью, иначе, если тебя все родственники забудут и никто тебя не поздравит с Рождеством, ты вот такого странного одинокого человека превратишься. В общем, надо ценить своих родственников, кем бы они ни были. Про это, но...
First movie that came to mind whenever he was asked this question. Kind of like how when I was 12, I remember saying Ted was my favorite movie. Like, sure, I obviously love Home Alone. I actually just rewatched it a few months ago for the holidays and was reminded just how great it really is. It's got some good G-rated humor that still puts a smile on my face, a great child performance from Macaulay Culkin, and just a real sweet and nice story about family. It's one of those perfectly paced movies too. It doesn't waste any...
Кстати, да, я сейчас подумал, что еще такая вещь, что обычно дети, актеры, они раздражают. А тут главный герой не сильно раздражает, даже не знаю почему.
At all. Every scene is a good time. Funny enough, it's not the only Christmas movie on this list. And honestly, I couldn't find shit on why Ford picked Home Alone, further proving my point that he pulled this one out of his ass. But that's fine. He picked a good one, right? The fact that a US president has seen Kieran Culkin act is worth something. My Darling Clementine is the favorite film of Harry Truman, the 33rd president of the United States, and it is a damn good pick, I gotta say. I mean, it's not number one on this list, but if I had more time to sit with this one and didn't just watch it for the first time this week, there's a world where it is number one, because I really liked this movie. The film is about the events leading up to the gunfight at the OK Corral. It's directed by John Ford, and it's amazing. I have seen less than 5% of John Ford's filmography, but I'm locking this one in as my favorite at the time of recording this. Not only does it highlight my favorite elements of the Western genre, the heightened
Самый любимый режиссер это Джон Форд.
individualism and the need for revenge, but I also find it extremely romantic. The romance is used sparsely in the film, bold for a movie titled My Darling Clementine, but to me it read as Ford making the case for love being the only true constant in the middle of all this. Maybe this is just because of how great Henry Fonda is, but it's the most I've ever seen through the narrow-minded view of a Western protagonist. You can feel his loneliness in some of these scenes, and it's not just his character. A lot of these characters are so profoundly sad to me, especially Doc Holliday, which is simply not something I'm used to seeing in Westerns. I'm used to seeing these very shielded up men who can't have feelings, but...
Фибельманы же тоже заканчиваются, да, Фордом, по-моему, в конце, он к Форду приходит.
This one really stood out. Goes without saying that I can't wait to go deeper with this one on a rewatch, and after familiarizing myself a bit more with Ford's work. Also, it's some of the most captivating black and white cinematography I've ever seen. Have to put that out there. According to Focus Features, Truman had a connection to the film because he and Fonda were both plain speakers. Other than that, I couldn't find much else on why this was his favorite, but I respect the hell out of it. Excellent pick.
Опачки.
Citizen Kane is the favorite film of the 45th president of the United States, Donald.
Ну, такое. Citizen Kane, конечно, прикольный в визуальном плане, и он очень стильный, очень модный для своего времени сделанный, но сама история, конечно, что как бы такого прекрасного человека просто все пошло под откос из-за бабы, она немного напрягает, от нее становится грустной, она меня не впечатляет.
Trump actually lists a handful of movies as his favorites,
Вот Трамп.
which include Goodfellas.
Ну, очевидно, что все эти списки, все эти фильмы придумывают просто политологи, которые имидж создают, и, разумеется, ни у кого не будет ни ада каннибалов, ни техасской резни бензопилой, потому что это просто как бы фигово для имиджа было бы.
Godfather and Gone with the Wind. You might be quick to say Trump, being who he is, only picked Citizen Kane because it's widely regarded as the best movie ever made, and he just...
То есть очевидно, что для как бы политика, который топит там за бизнесменов, за какое-то восстановление Америки за счет вот этих людей, этот фильм как бы как образ, наверное, выбрать было бы правильно.
Wanted to be the guy to pick that, but looking a little closer, there's no doubt in my mind it's his favorite movie. It's actually one of the most fascinating choices on this list. In doing research for this video, I found a video from 2002 where Errol Morris, of all people, interviewed Trump about his love for Citizen Kane. It's basically Trump doing a movie review, and it's a really bizarre video to watch, because in talking about Citizen Kane, it's almost like there's some sort of self-reflection going on, which I've personally never seen in Trump.
He and his wife getting further and further apart as he got wealthier and wealthier. Perhaps I can understand that.
He both connects to the story and...
Деньги разъединяют, понятно. Так что, господа, присылайте деньги мне, чтобы такое не испытывать.
Understands the movie, but at the same time completely
Я готов буду стать держателем этого зла.
reads the entire thing. What's so fascinating about it is that even if this review is from 2002, Trump is still obviously a very rich and successful businessman by this point. He's living the life of Kane, in a way not unlike JFK idolizing Nixon idolizing Patton. I believe Trump wanted to be Kane.
No, if you could give Charles Foster Kane advice, what would you say to him?
Get yourself a different woman.
Crazy. To Trump, it was never Kane's own emptiness that came
Кто бы Кейну это не посоветовал бы.
back to bite him. It wasn't the self-destructive pursuit of wealth and power.
Типа проблема в том, что Кейн не готов это признать себе. Как бы на этом вся трагедия строится. Он так как бы уверен в себе, настолько эгоистичен, что он готов изменить реальность, что у него талантливая жена, что она должны все восхищаться ее талантом. Никто не посмеет, чтобы они смеялись. Вот эта проблема. Непризнание своих ошибок.
It was the people around him. It was his woman. He understands the character and the tragedy of the film, but not why any of this happened. It's the most self-aware I've seen Trump, yet the most unself-aware at the same time. Just a surreal clip. As for my own thoughts on the film, yeah, it's great. I just rewatched it for the first time since my freshman year of film school. It coincidentally was a Monkey Mondays movie, and yeah, it really holds up. Go figure. It's one of the most compelling tragedies of all time, and it's directed with a level of confidence that is still exciting today. It's Citizen Kane. Come on. It's a Wonderful Life was the favorite film of Ronald Reagan, the 40th president of the United States. As most of you know, Reagan is one of the only presidents on this list to actually be directly involved in the movie business, having starred in a number of films, most notably Bedtime for Bonzo, which I gotta watch for Monkey Mondays at some point. He was also a big fan of It's a Wonderful Life. Yes, he also liked High Noon, as well as The Sound of Music, but It's a Wonderful Life felt like the most interesting of the bunch. If you can't tell by how deep into the list we are, I'm also a big fan of It's a Wonderful Life. It's the only Christmas movie that is consistently put on every Christmas by my family, so I not only grew up watching it, but I still really appreciate it. Just this last year, something really clicked about it, and I fell in love with its overwhelming sense of...
Не помню, по-моему, мы его смотрели как-то ее заказывали, он такой очень милый, если я не ошибаюсь. Короче, какой-то очень... Такой классический американский рождественский фильм как-то заказывали. По-моему, это был как раз вот этот вот.
Optimism in the end. While some of it can come across a bit absurd and easy to poke fun at, like the convenience and unbelievable outpouring of love and support George Bailey receives at the end of the film, spoiler alert, I find all of that to be just heartwarming, and it gets me choked up every single time. A literal Christmas miracle. It's a film that manages to guide you down the path that leads to someone being at the lowest place you can possibly be.
Я его смутно помню, что-то по типу, по-моему, рождественской истории.
And it brings you out of that place in a way that makes you feel hopeful. When you finish watching It's a Wonderful Life, you feel like you're glowing.
Если его смотришь редко очень, нету на это времени. Вообще, все, что я смотрю на стримах в последнее время. Потому что больше времени нету на просмотр.
While I couldn't find a ton on why Reagan connected to the film, I did find an interesting analysis by Professor Robert Reich on how the film has been viewed through a political lens throughout history, specifically how it was at one point declared communist propaganda. It's not only a fascinating read that ties things back to the Trump era in an eerie way, but also makes this being one of Reagan's favorites just that much more mind-boggling, as it makes an excellent connection between Reagan's actions and those of Potter, the villainous banker in the film. But on the other side of things, an article from The Guardian by David Mamet, titled It's a Conservative Life, suggests that the film is capitalist propaganda, how it becomes, quote, the fantasy of the compassionate conservative. Mamet makes the connection between the fantasy-like promises of the Reagan administration with the fantasy-like outcomes of the film. I disagree that the film is capitalist propaganda. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but I do think this article does a pretty good job at making it make sense why Reagan may have connected to the film. Lastly, The Godfather is the favorite film of Barack Obama, the 44th president of the United States.
Даже удивительно, почему он у Обамы самый любимый.
With The Godfather feels both unfair and frankly underwhelming. It's just...
Ну, кстати, наверное, как бы, если чуть раньше этот фильм бы обозначить любимый до Обамы, то скажешь, что человек как-то связан с мафией, восхищается мафией. А, наверное, к президентству Обамы этот фильм уже слишком стал классический, и такие коннотации уже невозможно сделать.
damn good
Почему не Get Out?
top this list, but I can't deny it's the best movie on this list. It's The Godfather. Obama has one of the funniest quotes on this list. When asked about his favorite movie, he answered, The Godfather, 1 and 2. 3, not so much. For the sake of this vid, I'll stick to 1, even though he did say Godfather 2 was maybe his favorite movie while delivering a speech in Lake Tahoe.
Ну, фильм про то, как мафия представлена как политики, и он себя тоже, видимо, имеет таким политиком. Кстати, Томас Манн, я ничего не читал. Иван Борисов, здравствуйте, приветствую вас.
I'm gonna stick to 1, I'm sorry. Directed by the guy that wrote Patton, good for him. The Godfather is one of those classics that has garnered such a reputation, to watch it without those expectations is kind of impossible. When I first watched it, I was taken aback by how large it felt, despite being at its core a film about family. But with time and with repeated viewings, I've come to appreciate how detailed and rich the film is. Think of the best scenes of Succession ever made. Which it is. And that is all the president's favorite movies. What did we learn? I don't know. I guess...
Мы выучили, что как бы вкусы президента достаточно пресные.
Some stuff. Thanks for watching. Go watch these films and form your own opinions. Don't forget to vote.
Очень познавательно было.
I want to thank this week's sponsor, Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, maybe you're even running for president, you're probably going to need a website. And Squarespace is the best place to make that happen. You can start a completely personalized website with their new guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, where you can choose from professionally curated layout and styling options to build a unique online presence from the ground up, tailored to your brand or business and optimized for every device. You can easily launch that website of yours and get discovered fast with integrated, optimized SEO tools so that you show up more often to more people and grow the way you want. Not to mention their video collection feature, which allows you to show off your videos and the work that you've made. Organize your video library and showcase your content on beautiful video pages. You can even sell access to your video library by adding a paywall to your content. And you can grow credibility and engage visitors with an unrivaled suite of visual design effects built in and ready to go on any Squarespace website. Create your online aesthetic with dozens of modern and intuitive options, then connect social and multimedia accounts in just a few clicks to extend your brand's footprint. Go to squarespace.com, start your free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Karsten to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.
Так, спасибо большое, Ноэл, за 1550 рублей. Заказывайте видео по тарифу 50 рублей 1 минута. И также заказывайте фильмы, сериалы, анимации.